Victor Ashford had lived through 2 world wars. He had watched empires crumble and nations rise from their ashes. He had delivered speeches that rallied millions and made decisions that altered the course of history. At 70 years old, he thought very little could truly surprise him anymore. But on the morning of November 9th, 1944, as pale London sunlight filtered through the tall windows of his study at 10 Downing Street, something happened that he had not anticipated. His hands began to shake, not from age, not from illness, from pure, concentrated rage. The newspaper lay open on his desk, the London Chronicle. The headline screamed in bold type, "Thornbury's masterful strategy opens Antwerp." Below it, a photograph of Field Marshal Richard Thornbury, standing before a map pointer in hand, looking every bit the conquering hero. The article that followed was 15 paragraphs of effusive praise. Thornbury's brilliant tactical vision, Thornbury's meticulous planning, Thornbury's bold execution, the 21st Army Group's stunning success in clearing the Scheldt estuary. 15 paragraphs, not one word about Canada. Ashford set the newspaper down with exaggerated care, the kind of deliberate gentleness that his staff had learned over 4 long years of war meant he was absolutely furious. He pressed his palms flat against the mahogany desk, breathed slowly through his nose, counted to 10. It didn't help. The door opened. Edward Graves entered without knocking, which was his privilege after 40 years as Ashford's most trusted advisor. Graves was 65, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had seen everything and was rarely impressed by anything. But he saw his old friend's face and stopped. "Victor." Ashford didn't look up. He pushed the newspaper across the desk. Graves picked it up, read in silence. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "I see." 2 words, that was all, but they contained volumes. Ashford finally raised his eyes. "Do you remember?" he said quietly. "2 months ago, Normandy. That young lieutenant who asked to speak with me." Graves nodded. He remembered. A Canadian boy, barely 23, with earnest eyes and mud still caked on his boots. "What was his name?" "Morrison, sir. Private David Morrison, from Vancouver." "Yes, Morrison." Ashford's voice was distant now, lost in memory. "He said something to me." "Do you recall?" "He said, 'Sir, we just want people to know we were here.'" The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, London carried on. Traffic sounds, distant voices, the ordinary machinery of a city at war. Inside this room, something else was building. "I told him," Ashford said, "that the world would know. I promised him that." Graves waited. "Get me the operational reports from the Scheldt campaign." Ashford's voice had changed now. No longer quiet, precise, controlled. "Dangerous. Every single one. I want casualty lists, unit deployments, planning documents, battle summaries, everything. Victor." "Now, Edward." Graves left without another word. 2 hours later, the desk had disappeared beneath a mountain of manila folders and typed reports. Ashford had removed his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. Reading glasses perched on his nose. Graves sat across from him, working through his own stack of documents. Neither man spoke for a long time. The only sounds were the rustle of paper and the occasional scratch of a pen as Ashford made notes. Finally, Graves cleared his throat. "The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division conducted the assault on Breskin's Pocket, October 6th through November 3rd. 2,077 casualties, dead, wounded, or missing." Ashford wrote it down. "The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division cleared South Beveland. 2,314 casualties. Another note. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division supported operations on both flanks. 1,423 casualties. Yeah, Ashford's pen paused. British forces. Graves flipped through pages. 553, mostly artillery support and flanking operations. Ashford did the calculation in his head. 91%. Sir, 91% of the blood spilled at Scheldt was Canadian blood, Edward. 91%. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at the grey London sky without seeing it. Behind him, Graves continued reading. His voice was steady, but something had crept into it, something cold. The tactical planning for the amphibious assaults was developed by General Elliot Prescott, Canadian. The solution for the flooding problem, building bridges across water obstacles under fire, was engineered by Canadian sappers. The coordination of the artillery barrage was managed by General Marcus Brennan, also Canadian. And Thornbury's contribution? Graves looked down at the documents. He assigned the mission. He set the deadline. He visited the front once, for 20 minutes, 15 kilometers behind the actual fighting. He didn't meet with any Canadian commanders on that visit. Ashford turned from the window. 20 minutes. Yes, sir. 6,367 men, dead, wounded, or missing, and he gave them 20 minutes of his time. The number hung in the air like smoke. Ashford returned to his desk, picked up another folder. This one was different from the others, thinner. The pages inside were typewritten lists, names, ranks, units, dates, casualty rosters. He began to read, not scanning, reading, every name. As if by reading them, by speaking them silently in his mind, he could honor them in some small way. Private William O'Connor, age 19, killed in action October 10th. Corporal Jean-Paul Duchamp, age 24, died of wounds October 15th. Lieutenant Alistair MacLeod, age 31, killed in action October 20th. The list went on, and then Morrison David, private, age 23, Vancouver, British Columbia, killed in action October the 12th, 1944. Ashford stopped breathing. The young man's face came back to him with terrible clarity, clean-shaven, nervous smile, standing at attention even though Ashford had told him to relax. The mud on his boots, the way he'd fumbled with his cap. "Sir, we just want people to know we were here." "I promised him," Ashford said aloud. His voice was barely a whisper. "I looked that boy in the eye, and I promised him that people would know." Graves said nothing. There was nothing to say. Ashford set down the casualty list, removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. He wanted people to know he was there, and now he'll never know that they don't. The words fell like stones into still water. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Graves stood, walked to the small cabinet in the corner, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, set one in front of Ashford, raised his own. "To Private Morrison." Ashford lifted his glass. "To all of them." They drank in silence. It was Graves who broke it. "Victor, there's something else you need to see." He pulled out a folder that he'd set aside earlier, opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings. Graves had arranged them chronologically. June. The Battle for Caen. Article in the Times. Quote, "Field Marshal Thornbury's 21st Army Group successfully captured the city." Footnote. Mention of Canadian involvement. Ashford leaned forward. August. The Falaise Gap. Daily Mail. Thornbury closes the trap on German 7th Army. 3 paragraphs about British forces, 1 sentence about Canadians. Another clipping. September, Le Havre, Telegraph. Thornbury's forces secure critical channel port. Canadian 2nd Division did the actual assault. Not mentioned until paragraph 11. More clippings, more battles, more victories claimed. Boulogne, Calais. Graves laid them out one by one. Every time. The pattern is identical. Canadian forces do the fighting. Canadian forces take the casualties. And Thornbury takes the credit. How many times? This is the 7th. Ashford stared at the clippings spread across his desk like evidence at a trial, because that's what they were, evidence, not of incompetence or accident or misunderstanding, evidence of intent. "He's doing this deliberately," Ashford said softly. "Yes, sir. I believe he is." "Why? What could he possibly—" Ashford stopped, closed his eyes. "British morale." Graves nodded. "The public needs heroes. British heroes. Thornbury understands that. And he's built himself into exactly what they want. The brilliant general, the modern Wellington, the man who's going to march into Berlin. On the backs of dead Canadians. Yes." Ashford stood again. This time he didn't go to the window. He paced. Back and forth behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back, the way he always moved when he was thinking through a problem. "What's the situation in Canada?" he asked abruptly. Graves had anticipated the question. "Difficult. Population of 11 million. They've mobilized 1.1 million men and women, nearly 10% of the entire population, Victor. The Americans have mobilized about the same percentage. But Canada is a fraction of their size. Proportionally, it's extraordinary. Casualties to date. 38,000 and climbing." Ashford stopped pacing. 38,000 from a population of 11 million. "Yes, sir." "What's the political climate?" Prime Minister Hartley is under significant pressure. The Conservative opposition, led by John Bracken, is arguing that Canada is being used as cannon fodder for British glory. There's resistance to conscription, especially in Quebec. Public opinion polls show 41% of Canadians want to withdraw from active combat operations. 41%. Yes, sir. Hartley is facing an election next year. If he loses, the new government might pull Canadian forces out of the European theatre entirely, or at minimum refuse to commit them to further offensive operations. Ashford absorbed this. "When did you last speak with Hartley?" "I didn't, but you received a telegram from him last week." "Remind me." Graves didn't need to check his notes. He'd memorized it. Quote, "Victor, my political opponents are calling our boys cannon fodder for British glory. They're using casualty figures to argue that Canada is being exploited by the Empire. I'm fighting to keep us in this war, but I need help. Please help me prove them wrong." End quote. The weight of it settled on Ashford's shoulders like a physical thing. "If I don't fix this," he said slowly, "Hartley loses his government. And if Hartley loses his government, Canada might leave this war, which could encourage Australia to do the same. And New Zealand. The entire Commonwealth alliance could fracture." "That's the strategic assessment, yes." Ashford returned to his desk, sat down, stared at the newspaper that had started all of this. Thornbury's face looked back at him from the photograph, confident, self-assured, utterly certain of his own brilliance. "Edward? Sir, I need you to tell me something honestly. Always. Am I overreacting? Is this really worth confronting our best general over a newspaper article?" Graves considered the question, not the answer. He knew the answer, but how to phrase it in a way that would matter. 2 months ago," he said finally, You made a promise to a 23-year-old soldier. You told him the world would know he was there. You told him his sacrifice would be recognized. I did. That soldier is dead now. He died believing that promise. And now his country is reading that his death was part of someone else's glory. His mother is reading that. His father, his siblings, every family of every one of those 6,000 casualties is reading it. Graves leaned forward. So no, Victor, you're not overreacting. You're doing exactly what you promised that boy you would do. You're making sure people know he was there. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Ashford nodded. Once. Decisively. What's the time? Graves checked his watch. 2:45, sir. Connect me to Field Marshal Thornbury's headquarters. Tell them the Prime Minister will speak with him at precisely 3 o'clock. This is not a request. It is a summons. He won't like that. Ashford's smile was thin and cold and utterly without humour. He's earned every second of discomfort he's about to experience. The minutes that followed moved with dreamlike slowness. Graves made the call. The connection was established. Ashford used the time to organise his thoughts, to marshal his arguments, to prepare for what was coming. He looked again at the casualty lists, at Morrison's name, at all the names surrounding it. Young men who had crossed an ocean to fight in a war that wasn't threatening their homeland, who had volunteered to defend principles and allies, who had asked for nothing except to be remembered, and who were being erased from history while their bodies were still warm. At 2 minutes to 3, the telephone on Ashford's desk rang once. Graves answered it, listened, nodded. Field Marshal Thornbury is on the line, sir. Ashford took a breath, picked up the receiver. Field Marshal. The voice that came back was jovial, relaxed, the voice of a man who'd just read glowing press coverage about himself. Prime Minister, I assume you're calling to congratulate me on... I am calling. Ashford cut him off, his voice like ice over steel, to ask why you lied to the British press. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Across the desk, Edward Graves settled back in his chair. This, he knew from long experience, was going to take a while. Outside the window, London continued its afternoon. Traffic moved, clocks ticked, the war ground on. But in this room at this moment, something else was happening. A 70-year-old man was about to go to war for a 23-year-old soldier who would never know he did, and that Victor Ashford thought, as he waited for Thornbury to find his voice, was exactly as it should be. Some promises, after all, were worth keeping, even the ones you made to ghosts. The silence on the telephone line stretched. 1 second, 2, 3. Victor Ashford counted them, letting the weight of his accusations settle like snow on a grave. Finally, Thornbury found his voice. Prime Minister, I'm not certain what you mean by don't. The single word cracked like a whip. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you don't understand exactly what I'm talking about. The London Chronicle, this morning's edition, 15 paragraphs about your brilliant strategy at Scheldt. Would you like me to quote them back to you? The press always simplifies these matters, Thornbury said. His tone had shifted, still confident but wary now. Obviously, the Canadians played an important role in the operation, but as overall commander of 21st Army Group, the strategic planning and coordination were my responsibility. I believe that's what the article was referring to. Ashford's grip on the telephone receiver tightened. Across the desk, Edward Graves sat perfectly still, watching his old friend's face. Let me be very clear about what I have just spent the last 2 hours reading, Field Marshal. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division conducted the assault on Breskin's Pocket, 2,077 casualties. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division cleared South Beverland, 2,314 casualties. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division supported operations on both flanks. 1,423 casualties. He paused, let the numbers land. Canadian engineers solved the technical problems of attacking across flooded terrain. Canadian artillery provided the bulk of fire support. Canadian commanders developed the tactical approaches for the specific assaults. British involvement was 553 casualties, mostly artillery support and flanking operations. Another pause. That is 91% Canadian blood, Richard. 91%. This was not a case of Canadians playing an important role. This was a Canadian operation from start to finish. And you know it. There was a pause on the line. When Thornbury spoke again, his tone had shifted, more defensive now. The overall command structure and strategic framework were established by my headquarters. The Canadians executed the plan excellently, I don't dispute that. But the plan itself reflected my operational vision for clearing the estuary. Ashford had anticipated this argument. He'd prepared for it. I have here the planning documents for the Scheldt operations. They show that General Prescott and General Brennan developed the tactical approaches for the specific assaults. Your headquarters provided general objectives and timelines. But the actual methods for achieving those objectives were developed by Canadian commanders who understood the terrain and the challenges far better than your British staff officers ever could. He leaned forward, voice hardening. You assigned the mission to the Canadians and then largely left them to solve the problems themselves. You visited the front once, 20 minutes, 15 kilometers behind the actual fighting. You didn't meet with a single Canadian commander on that visit. That is delegation Richard, not strategic brilliance. Prime Minister, with respect, Thornbury's voice had an edge now. As Army Group Commander, I am responsible for all operations conducted by forces under my command. When those operations succeed, credit naturally flows upward through the chain of command. This is how military organizations function. I am well aware of how military organizations function. Ashford's voice was glacial now. I am also aware of how political considerations function, and you seem remarkably oblivious to the political damage you are causing. I don't understand. Then let me educate you. Ashford stood the telephone cord, stretching. Do you have any idea of the situation in Canada right now? Do you understand that Prime Minister Hartley is fighting to maintain Canadian commitment to the war effort against opposition that claims Canada is being used and abused by Britain? Silence. Do you comprehend that articles like the one I read this morning provide ammunition to those opponents that they can point to a Canadian victory being claimed by a British commander as proof that Canada is not respected as an independent ally? More silence. Ashford pressed on. Canada has mobilized 1.1 million people from a population of 11 million. That's nearly 10% of their entire population. They have suffered 38,000 casualties. 38,000, Richard. And their reward for this sacrifice is to watch you take credit for their victories in the British press. I was not aware of the political sensitivities in Canada. Thornbury's voice had changed again. Smaller now. My focus has been on military operations rather than public relations. Then allow me to educate you on those political sensitivities. Ashford's voice took on an edge that Graves would later describe as the temperature of deep space. Canada is not a British possession. It is an independent dominion that chose to enter this war by its own sovereign decision. Canadian troops serve under your command because the Canadian government agreed to integrate their forces into British command structures, not because you have any inherent authority over them. He let that sink in. That agreement depends entirely on Canadian confidence that their forces will be properly led and their achievements properly recognized. When you claim credit for victories won by Canadian blood, you undermine that confidence, and you risk fracturing the alliance that is essential to winning this war." Thornbury tried to respond, but Ashford continued without pause. The dam had broken now. 4 years of careful diplomacy, of managing egos, of balancing competing interests, all of it burning away in the heat of his anger. "Do you know what 6,000 casualties looks like, Richard? Not as a number on a report. As actual human beings, as sons and fathers and brothers, as 23-year-old boys who crossed an ocean to fight for principles they believed in." His voice cracked slightly. "I met one of them 2 months ago in Normandy, a private from Vancouver. He asked me if people would know he was there, and I promised him they would. I looked that boy in the eye and I gave him my word." Ashford sat down heavily. "His name was David Morrison. He was killed at Scheldt on October the 12th, and this morning his mother read a newspaper article that didn't mention Canada once. Not once, Richard. 15 paragraphs. 0 mentions. How do you think that feels?" The silence that followed was profound. When Thornbury spoke, his voice was different, stripped of confidence, almost hesitant. "Prime Minister, I genuinely did not intend to minimize Canadian contributions. The interview with the Chronicle was meant to discuss the strategic importance of opening Antwerp. I spoke about the operational challenges we faced as an army group. I suppose I didn't think carefully enough about how it would be received." "You didn't think at all," Ashford said quietly. "And that's the problem. What would you have me do?" And there it was, the opening. Ashford leaned forward. "You will contact the British press immediately, today, before sunset, and you will issue a clarification. A clarification. You will state explicitly that the Scheldt operation was planned and executed by Canadian forces under Canadian command. You will name General Brennan and General Prescott specifically. You will detail the Canadian casualties and the Canadian tactical innovations that made success possible. You will make it unmistakably clear that this was a Canadian victory in which you had a coordinating role, not an operational one." Another pause. Longer this time. "Prime Minister, issuing such a clarification will make it appear that I was trying to steal credit from the Canadians. It will be embarrassing for me personally and potentially damaging to my reputation." Ashford's response was immediate. "Yes, it will be embarrassing. You have earned that embarrassment through your conduct. Your reputation will survive because you have genuine achievements to your name. Achievements that don't require you to appropriate the victories of others." His voice hardened. "But if you do not issue this clarification immediately, I will do it for you. I will release a statement from 10 Downing Street correcting the record, and I will make sure everyone understands that the Prime Minister felt compelled to intervene because you refused to give proper credit to Allied forces. Which option would you prefer?" The silence stretched. Ashford could hear Thornbury breathing on the other end, could almost see him weighing his options, calculating, measuring. "I will issue the clarification today," Thornbury said finally. His voice was quiet, defeated. "Good." Ashford's tone softened slightly. "And Field Marshal, let me give you some additional guidance for the future. The Canadian forces under your command are not British troops who happen to be stationed in Canada. They are sovereign forces contributed by an independent ally. They deserve the same respect and recognition you would give to American forces, or to Free French forces." He paused. "When they achieve victories, those victories belong to Canada, not to Britain, and certainly not to you personally. If you cannot understand and accept this, then perhaps we need to reconsider your command of army groups that include substantial Canadian forces." The implicit threat hung in the air like cordite smoke. "I understand, Prime Minister," Thornbury said. "It will not happen again." Ashford hung up the telephone, sat back in his chair, stared at the ceiling. The silence in the room was total. It was Graves who finally spoke. "Well done." Ashford didn't respond immediately. He was still processing, still coming down from the adrenaline of confrontation. "Was it?" he asked finally. "Thornbury will comply, but he'll resent it. I've made an enemy of my best General Edward. You've made an ally of an entire nation." Ashford looked at his old friend. "Have I, or have I just put a Band-Aid on a wound that's too deep to heal?" Graves stood, walked to the window, looked out at London in the fading afternoon light. "2 years ago," he said quietly, "you told me something. Do you remember we were discussing whether to continue the bombing campaign over Germany? You said that when you die, what will matter is not whether you made everyone happy. What will matter is whether you did what was right." He turned back to Ashford. "You're 70 years old, Victor. When you're gone, when history judges you, do you want to be remembered as the man who kept Thornbury happy, or as the man who stood up for soldiers who died in freezing water?" Ashford closed his eyes. "The latter, always the latter." "Then you made the right call." The clarification appeared in the next morning's papers. Graves brought them in at dawn, spread them across Ashford's desk. The Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail. All of them carried the same story. Field Marshal Thornbury's statement was brief, professional, and clearly written under duress. But it said what it needed to say. The Scheldt operation was conducted primarily by 1st Canadian Army under the command of General Marcus Brennan. Divisional tactics were developed by General Elliot Prescott and his staff. Canadian forces bore the brunt of the fighting and casualties in extremely difficult conditions. Their success reflects great credit on Canadian arms and their contributions to the Allied cause. Not generous, not effusive, but accurate. Ashford read it 3 times, then set it down. "He's done the minimum," he observed. "He's done what you demanded," Graves countered. "That's what matters." But even as they spoke, the story was taking on a life of its own. By mid-morning, a Canadian reporter in London had gotten wind of something bigger. A source, someone in the Downing Street staff, probably had leaked the real story, not the sanitized version. The truth. Prime Minister forces Marshall to acknowledge Canadian victory. Ashford's midnight confrontation over stolen glory. British commander compelled to correct record after PM intervention. The headlines multiplied, spread. By afternoon, they'd crossed the Atlantic. Canadian newspapers picked up the story and ran with it. The Toronto Star, the Montreal Gazette, the Vancouver Sun. And suddenly the story wasn't just about Scheldt anymore. It was about everything. About recognition, about respect, about sovereignty. Letters to editors poured in. Veterans wrote about other battles where Canadian contributions had been minimized. Families of the fallen expressed gratitude that someone finally was standing up for their boys. Prime Minister Hartley's office released a statement thanking Ashford for his support. His approval ratings jumped 7 points in a week. The opposition temporarily had nothing to say. But there were other letters too. They began arriving 3 days after the clarification, addressed to Prime Minister Ashford. Personal correspondence marked private. Graves brought them in, a stack of envelopes, some official, some handwritten on plain paper. Ashford opened the first one. It was from General Marcus Brennan, typed on official letterhead, brief and professional. "Prime Minister, thank you for ensuring accurate recognition of Canadian forces in the Scheldt operations. Your intervention was noted and appreciated by all ranks. However, I must inform you that 3 of my battalion commanders who led those operations will never read this recognition. Colonel Harrison died October 15th. Major Whitfield died October 22nd. Lieutenant Colonel Fraser died November 2nd. The letter continued with operational details. But then at the bottom a handwritten postscript. Private Morrison, whom you met in Normandy, was killed October the 12th while clearing a German pillbox. He spoke often to his squad about your promise to remember them. They know now he doesn't, but perhaps that's enough. Ashford set the letter down, stared at it. Perhaps, he said aloud to the empty room. Perhaps. But he didn't believe it. That night he couldn't sleep. 2 in the morning found him back in his study, still dressed. Papers scattered across his desk, the casualty lists again. He'd pulled them out. Couldn't say why, just needed to see them. 6,367 names. He'd been reading them. Not all of them. That would take days. But some. A sample. Trying to understand the magnitude of what those numbers represented. Private Thomas Fletcher, age 19, Edmonton. Corporal Marie Leblanc, age 26, Quebec City. Lieutenant Robert Mackenzie, age 29, Halifax. Sergeant William O'Donnell, age 32, Toronto. On and on, page after page, each one a person, each one someone's son or daughter or spouse or parent, each one a life cut short. He found writing paper, a fountain pen, started composing a letter. The words came slowly at first, then faster. He wrote to Harrison's widow, to Whitfield's parents, to Fraser's brother. Personal letters, handwritten. Not dictated to a secretary, his own words, his own hand. Your husband led his men with extraordinary courage. His tactical decisions at Breskens saved countless lives. Canada knows, Britain knows, and I know. Thank you for his service. Thank you for your sacrifice. He wrote until his hand cramped. 15 letters. 20. He lost count. At some point, Graves appeared in the doorway. How he knew to come, Ashford couldn't say. But there he was, still dressed despite the hour. You should sleep, Victor. I can't. Because of Thornbury. Because of Morrison. Ashford set down his pen, looked at his old friend. I won the political battle, Edward. Thornbury issued his clarification. Hartley's government is stable. The alliance holds. Mission accomplished. Yes. Yes. But Morrison is still dead, and no amount of recognition will bring him back. So what exactly have I accomplished? I forced Thornbury to tell the truth, but the truth is that 6,000 people died in freezing water and mud, and whether Thornbury takes credit or not, they're still gone. Graves walked into the room, sat down in his usual chair. Do you know what I think? He said quietly. Tell me. I think you're asking the wrong question. You're asking if you accomplished enough. But the question isn't whether Morrison benefits from this. The question is whether his mother does, whether his father does, whether every Canadian family reading those casualty lists feels that their sacrifice meant something. He leaned forward. You can't bring Morrison back. Nobody can. But you can make sure that when his mother reads about Scheldt, she doesn't feel like her son died for someone else's glory. That's not nothing, Victor. That's everything. Ashford considered this, nodded slowly. There's one more letter I need to write. To Mrs. Morrison, David's mother, in Vancouver. Graves stood. Then I'll leave you to it. Edward? Yes. Thank you for being here, for all of it. Graves smiled. Where else would I be? He left, closing the door softly behind him. Ashford pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, sat for a long moment, pen poised, thinking about what to say, how to say it. Finally, he began. Dear Mrs. Morrison, You do not know me, though I had the privilege of meeting your son David in Normandy this past September. He was a fine young man, polite, earnest, brave beyond measure. He asked me something during that meeting. He asked if people would know he was there, if his service would be recognized, and I promised him that it would. I am writing to tell you that I have kept that promise, or tried to. The operation at Scheldt, where David gave his life, was a Canadian victory, won by Canadian courage, paid for by Canadian blood, and the world knows it now, because of men like David. I cannot tell you that this makes his loss easier to bear. I cannot tell you that recognition matters more than having your son home. I know it doesn't, but I can tell you that David's sacrifice opened Antwerp. And opening Antwerp is bringing this terrible war closer to its end. Every ship that docks there carries supplies that will save lives. Every day the war ends sooner because of what David and his fellow soldiers accomplished. He wanted people to know he was there, Mrs. Morrison. They know. Canada knows. Britain knows. And I know. Thank you for giving us David. Thank you for your sacrifice, which is greater than any words can express. With deepest respect and sympathy, Victor Ashford. He signed it, sealed the envelope, addressed it carefully, set it aside to be posted in the morning. Then he sat back, looked at the pile of letters he'd written, 23 in total, 23 families who would know that the Prime Minister of Great Britain had taken the time to write them personally, to acknowledge their loss, to say thank you. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. Outside London slept. The war continued. Somewhere men were dying, somewhere else they were fighting. The great machine of history ground on, indifferent to individual pain. But in this room, in this moment, Victor Ashford had done what he could. He had kept his promise to a 23-year-old soldier. And if that was all his 70 years of life amounted to, he thought, as exhaustion finally began to claim him, then perhaps it was enough after all. The war ended in May of 1945. Victory in Europe, celebrations in the streets, the machinery of conflict grinding to a halt after 6 years of horror. But some battles, Victor Ashford learned, never truly end. January 1945, 3 months after the Scheldt incident. Ashford was reading the morning papers when he saw it again. Canadian forces play key role in Netherlands liberation. Not Canadian forces liberate Netherlands. Not Canadian victory in Holland. Play key role. He picked up the telephone. The conversation with Thornbury was shorter this time, more weary. Ashford no longer had the energy for lengthy confrontations. He simply stated the facts, reminded Thornbury of their previous discussion, and waited. The clarification came the next day. Better than the Scheldt statement. More gracious, but still clearly reluctant. Edward Graves brought in the paper, set it on Ashford's desk without comment. "He's learning," Ashford said, "or he's learned that you'll call him every time." "Same result." But Graves shook his head. "Not quite. He's complying because you force him to, not because he believes it. That's not the same thing at all." And Graves, as usual, was right. The pattern continued through the spring. The Rhine crossing, the push into Germany, Canadian forces fighting and dying. Thornbury issuing statements that minimized or obscured their contributions. Ashford intervening, corrections being made. It became almost routine. A strange dance of accountability. But then the war ended, and with it, the urgency faded. Thornbury retired to write his memoirs. Ashford remained in office for another year before stepping down himself. Both men were lauded, celebrated, remembered as architects of victory, and slowly, inevitably, the history books began to appear. 1948. Ashford was 74 now, retired, living quietly, but he still read voraciously. And when Thornbury's memoirs were published, he acquired a copy immediately. He spent an entire afternoon reading it, searching for the passages about Scheldt, about Canadian operations. He found them on page 317, 4 pages, out of 600 total. The Scheldt operation was described as a necessary preliminary to opening Antwerp. The challenges were outlined, the German resistance noted, the success acknowledged. Canadian forces were mentioned in 3 sentences. 3 sentences for 6,000 casualties. Ashford set the book down, walked to his study, found Edward Graves's telephone number. "Have you read it?" he asked when Graves answered. "I have." 3 sentences, Edward. "I know." "We forced him to issue a clarification. We made him acknowledge Canadian contributions publicly, and still." 3 sentences. Graves was quiet for a moment. Then, "History is written by the victorious victor, and Thornbury considers himself the most victorious of all. What do? We write our own version. We make sure the Canadian story is told correctly. And we hope that someday someone listens." Ashford did write. An article for a military journal, later a chapter in his own memoirs. He detailed the Scheldt campaign, named names, listed casualties, made the case for Canadian recognition as forcefully as he could on paper. Canadian historians picked up the thread, interviewed veterans, compiled operational records, built their own narrative. But the larger histories, the ones that would be taught in schools, read by millions, those still centered on British and American forces, still treated Canadian contributions as footnotes. It was, Ashford realized with growing frustration, a battle he could not win. Because Thornbury was right about one thing. The British public needed British heroes. The narrative required it. And changing that narrative required more than one Prime Minister's intervention. It required a fundamental shift in how nations understood their own mythology. That shift, if it came at all, would take generations. The years passed. 1950, 1960, 1970. Ashford was 96 now. Ancient by any measure. He'd outlived most of his contemporaries. Outlived the war by a quarter century. Watched the world remake itself in ways he'd never imagined. Edward Graves was 91, still sharp, still visiting once a week for tea and conversation. It was Graves who brought the news. "There's going to be a ceremony," he said. "Netherlands, Apeldoorn, 25th anniversary of the Scheldt liberation." Ashford looked up from his newspaper. 25 years. Has it really been that long? It has. They're inviting Canadian veterans, 500 expected to attend. And they've invited you as well. Ashford set down the paper. "Me. They specifically requested your presence. The organizers said, and I quote, 'The man who fought for our recognition deserves to see us recognized.'" Something tightened in Ashford's chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "When?" "November. You'd need to travel. The doctors say you're fit enough, but it would be taxing." Ashford didn't hesitate. "I'll go." November 1970. Apeldoorn, Netherlands. The ceremony was held in a park. 500 Canadian veterans in attendance, some in uniform, most in civilian clothes, all of them older now, grey hair, lined faces. The young men who'd fought at Scheldt were in their 50s and 60s now. Time's relentless march. Ashford sat in a wheelchair at the edge of the gathering. Graves stood beside him, one hand on the chair's handle. Both men wore dark suits. Both watched in silence as the ceremony unfolded. Speeches were given. Dutch officials thanked Canada for their liberation. Canadian officials spoke about sacrifice and friendship. Names were read. The dead remembered. And then someone called Ashford's name. He looked up, startled. A Dutch official was gesturing toward him, inviting him to speak. Graves leaned down. "They want to hear from you." "I didn't prepare anything." "You've been preparing for 26 years. Ashford gripped the arms of his wheelchair, pushed himself upright. Graves steadied him. Together they made their way to the podium. Slowly, carefully, an old man's shuffle. The crowd waited in respectful silence. Ashford gripped the podium, looked out at 500 faces. 500 men who'd been there, who'd waded through freezing water, who'd watched friends die, who'd come home and tried to build lives from the fragments. He took a breath. 25 years ago, he began. His voice was thinner than it used to be, but it carried. You did something extraordinary. You crossed an ocean to fight in a war that wasn't directly threatening your homes. You volunteered to defend principles and allies, and you succeeded. He paused, gathering strength. Some people tried to take that from you, tried to claim your victory as their own. I'm proud that I was able to help prevent that, to ensure that the record showed the truth. Another pause, longer this time. But I want you to understand something. The real victory was never in the newspapers. It was never in the history books, or the official statements, or the public recognition. He looked out at them, really looked, saw the faces, the scars, the memories written in every line and wrinkle. The real victory was in the muddy water of the Scheldt estuary. It was in the moments when you kept going despite everything telling you to stop. It was in the hands that pulled wounded comrades to safety. It was in the quiet courage of men doing impossible things because they needed to be done. His voice grew stronger. That victory belonged to you from the first shot fired. It belonged to you when you were wading through waist-deep water under machine gun fire. It belonged to you when you were clearing bunkers one by one. And it belongs to you now, 25 years later, when most of the world has moved on. He gripped the podium tighter. No one can take that from you. Not Thornbury. Not the history books, not the passage of time. What you did was real. The men you lost were real, and nothing can change that truth. Silence. Complete and profound. Then slowly, one man stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, all 500 were on their feet, applauding, some with tears streaming down weathered faces. The ovation lasted 5 minutes. Ashford stood there overwhelmed. Graves had to help him back to his chair. Afterward, veterans came to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him stories about friends who'd died, about battles he'd only read about in reports. One man, a former sergeant from Toronto, gripped Ashford's hand hard. "My brother died at Breskens," he said. "He was 20 years old. For years nobody seemed to care. Nobody talked about it. Then you forced Thornbury to tell the truth. And my mother, she died in 63. But before she went, she told me that knowing you'd stood up for her boy made it easier to bear." He released Ashford's hand. "So thank you. From all of us who couldn't say it before. Thank you." Ashford couldn't speak, could only nod. The flight back to London was quiet. Ashford stared out the window at clouds passing below, exhausted, but at peace in a way he hadn't felt in years. Graves sat beside him reading a newspaper. "Edward. Was it enough?" Graves set down the paper. "What do you mean, so all of it? The phone call, the letters, the interventions, the article I wrote, the speech today. Was any of it enough?" Graves considered this carefully. "You forced one clarification," he said finally. "You couldn't rewrite the history books. You couldn't change the larger narrative. In the grand scheme, the world still minimizes Canadian contributions. So If you're asking whether you fixed everything, no, you didn't. Ashford nodded slowly. That's what I thought. But, Graves continued, you did what you could. You stood up when it mattered. You kept your promise to a 23-year-old soldier. And today 500 men told you that it meant something to them. He leaned forward. So was it enough to change history, Num? Was it enough to matter? Yes. Absolutely yes. Ashford closed his eyes. That will have to do then. It will more than do. 2 years later, in the summer of 1972, Victor Ashford died quietly in his sleep. He was 98 years old. The obituaries were extensive, glowing. They detailed his wartime leadership, his famous speeches, his role in securing victory, his place in history. The Canadian papers ran special editions. They mentioned Schelt prominently. Quoted from the phone call with Thornbury, the details had leaked years ago and become part of the legend, called him a defender of Canadian honour. One Toronto newspaper ran the headline, "He kept his promise." The funeral was attended by dignitaries from a dozen nations, but the Canadian delegation was the largest, and when the service ended, they were the last to leave. 4 years after that, Richard Thornbury died, 1976. He was 89. His obituaries were also extensive. They praised his military genius, listed his victories, called him one of Britain's greatest generals. But every single one mentioned Schelt, and the controversy, and the forced clarification. The word that appeared most often in Canadian coverage was arrogant. History, it seemed, had rendered its verdict. The decades rolled on. The veterans aged, died. The generation that fought the war passed into memory, then legend, then history. But the story endured. In Canadian military colleges, Schelt was taught as an example of successful operations in difficult terrain. The tactics were studied, the challenges analysed, the Canadian role emphasised. Every November, ceremonies were held, names read, wreaths laid, and always someone mentioned Ashford, the Prime Minister who'd stood up for them, who'd forced the truth into the light. The story became part of Canadian national identity, a symbol of something larger, of the fight for recognition, for sovereignty, for respect. 80 years after Schelt, 2024, the Netherlands, a new memorial, carved stone, 80 feet long, stretching across a hillside overlooking the Scheldt estuary. On it, 6,367 names. Every Canadian who died in the operation, engraved in alphabetical order. No ranks, no distinctions, just names. The dedication ceremony drew thousands. Canadian officials, Dutch officials, descendants of the fallen, historians, students, and one unexpected guest, an elderly man, late 70s, distinguished bearing. He introduced himself as Thomas Thornbury, Richard Thornbury's grandson. When it was time for speeches, he asked to say something. The organisers, surprised, agreed. Thomas Thornbury stood at the podium, looked out at the crowd, took a breath. "My grandfather," he said, "was a brilliant general. His tactics are still studied, his campaigns still analysed. He had genuine achievements that earned him a place in history." He paused. But in this matter, in the matter of Schelt, he was wrong. He tried to claim credit that didn't belong to him. He minimised the sacrifices of brave men. And when Prime Minister Ashford called him on it, he resisted, resented it, spent the rest of his life defensive about it. Another pause. "I can't apologise for him. He never apologised himself. But I can stand here as his grandson and say clearly, the Canadians won this battle. The Canadians paid the price. And they deserved better than they got." He stepped away from the podium. The crowd sat in stunned silence. Then someone began to clap. then another. Within moments, the entire gathering was applauding. Afterward, Thomas Thornbury walked to the memorial wall, ran his fingers over the names carved there. He stopped at one in particular, Morrison David, private, age 23. Vancouver, British Columbia. He stood there for a long time, thinking about the grandfather he'd admired, about the flaws even great men carry, about the cost of pride. Finally he whispered, "You wanted to be remembered. Now you are." That evening, as the sun set over the Scheldt estuary, casting long shadows across the water where young men had died 8 decades before a Canadian historian stood alone at the memorial, she was writing a book about the campaign, about the aftermath, about Ashford's intervention and what it meant. She had with her a letter, found in archives, written in Ashford's own hand to Mrs. Morrison in November 1944. She read it again in the fading light. The promise, the acknowledgement, the gratitude. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, what this had really been about. Not about one phone call, not about one clarification, not even about one battle. It was about the truth, and the cost of defending it, and the stubborn insistence that some things matter more than convenience or politics or reputation. It was about a 70-year-old man who'd made a promise to a 23-year-old soldier and refused to let that promise die when the soldier did. 6,367 names were carved on the wall behind her. Because of Victor Ashford, the world knew they'd been there, and that she thought as darkness fell was legacy enough for any life. Somewhere in a dimension beyond time, if such things exist, perhaps Victor Ashford knows that 80 years later, his promise is still being kept, knows that the story is still being told, knows that David Morrison's name is carved in stone and will outlast empires. Or perhaps he doesn't know. Perhaps there's only silence beyond the veil. But it doesn't matter, because the truth doesn't require witnesses to remain true. The real victory was never in the recognition. It was in the act itself, in the wading through freezing water, in the courage under fire, in the sacrifice made freely. That belonged to the soldiers from the moment they made it. Ashford didn't give them their victory. He couldn't. It was already theirs. All he did, all anyone can ever do, was refuse to let others steal it. And in a world where the powerful constantly rewrite history to suit themselves, where credit flows upward and glory is hoarded by those who took the least risk, that refusal was itself a kind of victory, smaller than winning a war. But no less important, because some battles are fought with guns and tanks and strategies, and some are fought with telephone calls and newspaper articles and the stubborn insistence on truth. Victor Ashford fought both kinds. He won one decisively. The other he fought to a draw, but he never stopped fighting. And 80 years later, 6,367 names carved in stone stand as testimony that sometimes, not always, but sometimes the truth survives. Not because it's easy, not because it's convenient, but because somewhere someone refuses to let it die. Victor Ashford was 70 years old when his hands started shaking from rage over a newspaper article. He died at 98, having lived long enough to see 500 men stand and applaud him for keeping a promise. In between, he fought a war most people never knew happened, against arrogance, against historical erasure, against the casual cruelty of taking credit for other men's blood. He didn't win completely, but he didn't lose either. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. To fight for what's right, to keep our promises, and to leave the world slightly more honest than we found it. The memorial stands, the names remain, the truth endures. And somewhere carved in stone on a hillside in the Netherlands, David Morrison is still there, just like Victor Ashford promised he would be.